En los años 70, una mujer da a luz en un hospital español. Todo transcurre con normalidad, hasta que en el último momento ocurre algún problema. El niño recién nacido sale del quirófano a toda prisa, en brazos de una religiosa. Su madre apenas ha podido verlo de manera muy fugaz. Durante unos minutos todo es silencio y espera, pero sin que ella lo sepa, en el largo pasillo, vida y muerte se han cruzado. Por un instante, la criatura casi se ha rozado con otra que lleva mucho tiempo encerrada en la morgue del oscuro sanatorio. Una criatura envuelta en una manta, que sale de su ataúd refrigerado para cumplir una misión. Una terrible misión. Es un niño sin nombre. Un niño que sirve para estos casos de ladrones de almas. La madre recibe la trágica noticia. No hay nada que hacer. Su hijo ha fallecido y el doctor asiente con cara de circunstancias. Entonces el horror, el indescriptible horror, se apodera de todo. En pleno shock, la pobre madre ni siquiera percibe que aquel no es su hijo, que es otro desconocido, frío, sin nombre. Mientras tanto, en otra ala del hospital, el recién nacido, vivo y latente, es entregado en una cruel transacción. Dinero a cambio de vida. Al caer la noche, una mujer llora desconsolada en su habitación. Nunca volverá a ver a su hijo. Con el tiempo, este solo será un recuerdo. En el mismo instante, otras manos depositan al niño sin nombre en su nicho de metal. En él, envuelto por la oscuridad, reposará hasta que estos ladrones de almas lo necesiten de nuevo. Buenas noches y bienvenidos a la nave del misterio. Pues la verdad es que les voy a ser muy sincero, se hace duro observar esta recreación que hemos llevado a cabo con todo el respeto. No es un solo caso. Eso sería igual de grave, pero puede ser el retrato robot de muchos casos. El escándalo llega a un nivel que es difícil hasta de entender. Creo que es un enorme embulletazo en el inconsciente colectivo de este país. Pero ver esta recreación, hecha también por nuestro compañero Fernando Ribes, tan cruda, impresiona el doble si uno está acompañado de estos amigos, que son las caras y las voces de este problema, de este enorme problema que queremos que ustedes conozcan si no conocen ya, porque realmente la noticia está ahí. Pero a veces las noticias son una cosa que se va, que se olvida. Cuando uno ve en imágenes lo que pudo ser, yo creo que eso alcanza una fuerza tremenda.
¿Qué tal, amigos? Esto es El Mundo de Cabeza. Convento Santa María, Irlanda. La historiadora Catherine Coles recibe un llamado por un hecho que aconteció en el Convento Santa María de Irlanda. Al realizar una investigación exhaustiva, dio con un acontecimiento inimaginable. Al llegar al lugar, descubre una antigua fosa séptica, en la cual se encontraron 796 esqueletos de niños, desde recién nacidos hasta niños de 8 años, todos ellos enterrados sin ataúd ni lápida. Muy probablemente estos niños fueron enterrados en secreto por monjas del propio convento Santa María. Hasta el momento se desconoce los motivos exactos de las muertes de los niños, pero todo apunta a que pudo deberse a neumonía, malnutrición, tuberculosis o simplemente maltrato. William Joseph Dolan, familiar de un niño que vivió en esa institución, ha denunciado los hechos con la intención de esclarecer todos los actos acontecidos en aquel entonces. La fosa séptica había sido ya descubierta en el año 1975 por algunos de los vecinos del convento, pero hasta ahora ellos creían que se trataba simplemente de huesos de víctimas de la gran hambruna irlandesa del siglo XIX. El convento Santa María había sido en aquel entonces el resguardo de madres e hijos irlandeses. Miles de mujeres solteras y embarazadas, mal vistas por la sociedad, eran enviadas a este convento para dar a luz. Muchas de las veces a estas mujeres se les obligaba a dar en adopción a sus hijos. Recientemente fueron descubiertos registros del convento, donde se confirma que los 796 niños habían fallecido de hambre o de enfermedades infecciosas. Cabe destacar que este convento, al igual que otros más de la época, conocidos como asilos de las Magdalenas, no tenían buena fama. Se estima aproximadamente que 30,000 mujeres habían sido internadas en estas instituciones durante los 150 años que estuvieron operando. La mayoría de ellas habían ingresado en contra de su voluntad. Una vez dentro, eran obligadas a realizar trabajos físicos, sobre todo en el área de lavandería, y todo esto para cumplir su penitencia. El convento Santa María fue derribado hace algunos años, pero el lugar donde se encontraba la fosa común fue respaldada por los vecinos. El secretario de Estado de Educación de Irlanda ha solicitado una investigación exhaustiva respecto al caso. Mientras tanto, la historia del convento Santa María se ha teñido de rojo. Esto es El Mundo de Cabeza. Buenas noches.
Hace 32 años, Purificación Betegón daba a luz a sus gemelas en la clínica Santa Cristina de Madrid, pero nunca llegó a tenerlas en sus brazos.
Cuando yo me encuentro en la habitación oscura, pregunto que qué hago allí y me dicen que es que mis hijas son para la adopción. Pregunto que con qué derecho y quién ha dicho eso, y es la primera vez que oigo en mi vida la palabra Sor María.
Trasladaron a sus pequeñas a la incubadora. Purificación asegura que durante ese tiempo la religiosa trató de convencerla de la adopción, puesto que era joven y ya tenía otro niño, pero ella se negó tajantemente. 2 días después le comunicaron que sus gemelas estaban en estado de muerte cerebral, pese a que ella vio cómo se movían, y hubo más contradicciones.
Me preguntan por los nombres de las niñas, cuando a mí ya me habían dicho que habían fallecido, con lo cual interpreté que todo era falso, todo era una comedia.
Y esa creencia le ha movido para investigar y tratar de localizar documentos que le permitieran llegar hasta las hijas que supuestamente le arrebataron. En esa búsqueda, Purificación localizó su certificado de ingreso hospitalario.
El juez dijo que la primera que había que llamar era Sor María, puesto que en mis documentos consta, el día que yo ingresé, avisar a Sor María. Nombre y apellidos del padre de mis hijas, Sor María. Y en los documentos de mis hijas pone primera gemela adopción, segunda gemela adopción.
Ahora la religiosa tendrá que explicar ante el juez qué pasó con esas niñas. Será el próximo 18 de enero.
Hello, my name is Kevin Annett. I'm the Field Secretary of the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State. I'm here in New York City on February 7th with several very important announcements. This last week, the United Nations released a toothless and unenforceable statement on the rape and torture of children by the Roman Catholic Church. It's done nothing to stop that enormous crime and has allowed it to continue. And so now it's up to the people of the world through their own common law courts to take direct action to stop the crimes of the Vatican. If the United Nations was serious about combating the organized rape and trafficking of children that's allowed and encouraged to do so by Catholic canon law, it would treat the Vatican as the criminal organization that it is by revoking the diplomatic status of the Vatican at the UN and barring its representation on UN committees. It would encourage all nations to nullify their tax exemptions to the Catholic Church and revoke the Financial Concord Acts that unlawfully funneled billions of dollars of taxpayers' money into the Vatican Bank. And it would declare the Vatican Incorporated to be a transnational criminal organization under the UN Convention by that name. And it would bring civil court action to jail all known child raping priests and the high church officials who protect them. But the truth is the United Nations has done none of that, and thereby it has enabled the Church to continue its reign of terror against the innocent children all over the world, not tens of thousands as they name, but millions upon millions of victims of the Catholic Church, including children not yet born. The United Nations' refusal to take action against the crimes of the Catholic Church is unexplainable and unconscionable, especially in the light, last Monday, of a revelation that the criminal conspiracy to aid child trafficking has actually been broadened by the Vatican and was during the year 2010 through the collusion of Queen Elizabeth and the Church of England. And that conspiracy actually implicates the present Pope Francis as well. Last Monday, our organization revealed that on September 16th, 2010, the Vatican and the Crown of England, through their chief officers, entered into a formal criminal conspiracy to traffic children and aid and abet child rapists all over the world. That conspiracy occurred between Queen Elizabeth and former Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, at Holyrood Castle in Edinburgh, where as a condition of the merger of the Church of England and the Church of Rome, the Queen agreed to place all Anglicans under this notorious Catholic canon law known as Crimen Solicitanus. That law, which is still on the books, requires that all child rape be covered up by priests, therefore obstructing justice and subverting the sovereign laws of countries all over the world when it has to do with the protection of children, including the United States and Canada. The present Pope Francis, Jorge Bergoglio, has not only concealed this conspiracy, but recently has been named by a former insider in the Argentine government as actually having organized the trafficking of children in Argentina during the Dirty War in the 1970s. So last Tuesday, on the basis of these facts, our International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State petitioned the Common Law Court of Justice in Brussels to begin formal proceedings against Jorge Bergoglio, Pope Francis, to charge him with aiding and abetting human trafficking, inciting treason and crime, and subverting the law of nations through his policies and practices in the Church. Now, the opening hearings of that case against Jorge Bergoglio will begin no later than Monday, March 31st, 2014, after which a public summons will be issued against Pope Francis. The International Common Law Court has also been asked to name as defendants in this case the corporations of the City of London and the Crown of England, as well as the Vatican and the Jesuit Order. These corporations and their officers will be named as accessories to an ongoing crime against the children of the world enunciated in these policies. Well, now let me take a moment to discuss the second part of my announcement today, and why I'm saying this in front of the Canadian Consulate. Because this last week, I was informed by a British Member of Parliament in London that the Crown of England's Privy Council office in London is considering issuing an order to the Canadian Governor-General and Prime Minister's office to have me arrested and prosecuted for what they call sedition. In other words, I may be charged with treason by the British monarchy under the same repressive laws that imprisoned some of America's own founding fathers and many of her patriots. And I'm not alone in being targeted in this way, for 3 of my close associates in England and Canada were recently arrested and held without charges for having spoken out about the crimes committed against our children every day by the Crown of England, the Vatican, and courts sanctioned by these powers. In fact, it's Queen Elizabeth who has inflicted treason on her own people by violating English laws she swore to uphold and protect, by acting at the behest of a foreign power and placing England under the jurisdiction of that power, the Church of Rome and its child-killing policies that subvert our laws. She did that on September 16, 2010, with the connivance of Pope Benedict. And so under British law, she and all her heirs must immediately abdicate or be removed by Parliament. Well, it's no accident that my possible arrest was ordered by the Crown the very same week that we publicly revealed the Holyrood Agreement that implicates her with the Vatican. But no amount of threats can stop us from bringing out the truth. No amount of threat of imprisonment will stop the cries of these children all over the world. Because it's not these simple individual figureheads who we're naming, but entire institutions responsible for these crimes. In truth, the Crown of England and the Vatican have lost their moral and their legal authority. Their writs do not operate anymore. And so I appeal to all Americans here to help us in our struggle to stop our children and our liberties being subverted. So let me announce that in the event of my arrest or my detaining or harassment by the forces of the Crown of England or the Government of Canada, my lawyer has instructions to immediately apply in America to allow me to seek political asylum in this country so that I can continue to carry on this work to indict the criminals in church and state who are destroying our children and our future. I'm positive that the people of the world will rally around us at this time to stop these crimes and to allow justice to prevail. Thank you.
Con otro asunto, les decíamos solo arrancar el programa que había muerto Sor María. Les tengo que confesar que es una noticia que nos ha sorprendido a todos, a pesar de que su fallecimiento se produjo el pasado martes y fue enterrada ayer. Y digo que nos ha sorprendido porque el secretismo siempre ha rodeado la vida de esta religiosa, pero especialmente en estos últimos meses. Tanto es así que cuando tenía que comparecer ante el juez en Plaza Castilla, bueno, pues en el último momento nos dijeron que estaba indispuesta y dudamos de esos informes médicos.
La última hora del fallecimiento de Sor María lo confirma exclusivamente el convento donde ella estaba ordenada. Teo Ibernón se encuentra precisamente allí, en el lugar donde ha emanado y se ha confirmado la noticia. Teo, muy buenos días, última hora.
Buenos días, Alfonso. Esta mañana a primera hora sí nos confirmaban las compañeras, las hijas de la Caridad, en la residencia de San Vicente Paúl, en el centro de Madrid, que efectivamente Sor María había muerto. No nos quisieron dar ninguna información más, ni cómo había sido, tan solo nos habían dicho que había fallecido pues por su elevada edad, tenía 88 años. Y ahora donde nos encontramos es en el domicilio de Purificación Betegón. Recordaréis que su caso, que lo sacamos nosotros en primicia, en exclusiva, en Espejo Público, fue ella ha denunciado la desaparición de sus dos hijas nacidas en la clínica de Santa Cristina, donde Sor María ejercía en el año 1981, una fecha imborrable además, el 23 de febrero de 1981, y precisamente el viernes Sor María estaba llamada a declarar para su caso, pero Sor María no se presentó al final, aduciendo motivos de salud. También nos hemos enterado que efectivamente alegó unos informes médicos en los que se afirmaba que su estado era bastante delicado. Estamos a la espera de que venga Purificación. Vamos a ver cómo le ha sentado el fallecimiento de Sor María. Esta mañana a primera hora también le dábamos la noticia y se quedaba realmente sorprendida. Pero antes, si os parece, vamos a trazar un perfil de Sor María Gómez Balbuena.
El nombre de Sor María Gómez Balbuena está relacionado con decenas de casos de presuntos robos de bebés. Sor María trabajaba como asistente social en la clínica Santa Cristina, en Madrid, una maternidad a la que acudían muchas mujeres muy jóvenes, solteras y necesitadas. Sor María, hermana de la Caridad, las presionaba para que cedieran a sus hijos en adopción. Utilizaba métodos poco ortodoxos. La ley permitía que las madres tuvieran 6 meses para retractarse y recuperar a sus hijos, pero no era la ley de Sor María, como nos cuenta una enfermera que trabajaba con ella.
La chiquita esta tenía a la niña en brazos con una parienta suya para llevársela y se la quitó porque dice, has firmado y no te la puedes llevar. Y la chica se desplomó. Y entonces yo fui a socorrerla y me dijo, tú vete.
Santa Cristina funcionaba además como escuela de matronas. Sor María controlaba todo lo que ocurría en la clínica. Su obsesión eran aquellas madres que consideraba candidatas para entregar de mejor o peor grado a sus bebés.
Las alumnas de matrona me decía que les decía ella que cuando viniese alguna soltera que se lo apuntasen en la lista en una libreta. Y les decía, luego me tenéis que ayudar para que dejen los niños, porque estas pobres, ¿qué van a hacer con estos niños?
Es una tontería que lo busquen él. Porque sus padres son los que lo quieren. Y otros lo quieren. Otros dicen que no, Que su madre la que lo
Hombre,
en casa,
mire
la que
usted,
lo crió, no la que lo crió.
Exacto,
Porque no se quería esa amiga, se hubiese quedado con
pero
ella.
es lógico.
No siempre conseguía separar a las madres de sus hijos. En una ocasión, una mujer pudo ver a su bebé y ya nadie consiguió arrebatárselo. Se lo enseñó esta enfermera y casi le cuesta el trabajo.
Porque ¿cómo has hecho esto? Iba con un capitán de aviación. Esta niña era para un capitán de aviación, que iba a estar como una reina. Y le contesto yo, anda con su madre mejor.
Roman Catholic nuns, the brides of Christ, are seen universally as women who care for the weak and vulnerable. But more than 200 people claim they were mentally or physically abused in homes that were meant to care for them. The sisters say the claims are false. The victims say it's the church's time for penance. It could be any group of people going up on stage for a school reunion photograph, but it's not. And they didn't meet at any ordinary school. They met in 4 orphanages in Scotland run by the Poor Sisters of Nazareth, in Lasswade near Edinburgh, Glasgow, Kilmarnock and Aberdeen. Many of them haven't seen each other for 20, 30, even 40 years. Every one of these people says they suffered violent, abusive childhoods at the hands of Roman Catholic nuns into whose care they've been entrusted. But these are just some of the men and women who are fighting for compensation and an apology from the Catholic Church. Legal teams acting for them were astonished at the number of people who came forward with exactly the same stories of abuse from different homes, stretching back over half a century.
You were in Aberdeen? Nazareth House, Aberdeen.
When the allegations emerged about Nazareth House in Aberdeen last summer, the sisters themselves said nothing. But since a deluge of people have come forward making the same claims about other homes run by the sisters, their lawyers have denied all the allegations and the Bishop of Aberdeen has gone on the offensive.
There are some people who are clearly have got bad memories. Some people whose lives are not as happy as they ought to be, are looking for reasons why, and they're looking into their past. There are some people before whom lawyers have been dangling a pot of gold. There are a whole range of possible motives, some of which are perhaps more understandable and more acceptable, and others more reprehensible. I am simply saying that some people have been making fantastical accusations against the sisters.
The Catholic order looked after children in Nazareth houses from the early 1870s. Some were orphans, some had parents who were unable to look after them, but others were placed there by the children's panel for being uncontrollable or for petty crime. Thousands of children have been cared for by the Poor Sisters of Nazareth over the past century. Not all have happy memories. 263 have begun legal action. So are they fantasizing, or did it happen? Frontline's spoken to just over 100 former residents who are all suing the sisters. We interviewed some of them before the extraordinary reunion we organised in Glasgow.
It's a constant beating. They crucified us. They simply crucified us. When I saw that film recently of Schindler's List, all during the film, we had no Schindler. During the night, when they would be dressed completely in white, checking us to see if our arms were in the shape of a cross. If they weren't, you woke up to a thrashing. Bearing in mind our age then, and these tall ladies to me were dressed in nothing but white, and these straps in their hand. The nuns to us were next to God. And we would think they were right, and that it was us that were wrong. I would think it was. I used to pray to God, why is the devil in me? I'm always wrong.
That was 60 years ago, but other allegations of cruelty have been made by people who were in the homes right up until the late 1970s. This film was made in Kilmarnock in 1952. The children look well fed and well dressed, but do the pictures tell the real story? This is how one woman remembers being treated in the 60s as a 10-year-old because she was prone to fits.
Because they used to think that a lot of times I was doing it for attention and I was putting it on, I used to get punchings, and they would take me and take my clothes off, take all my clothes off, and I'd get battered and shoved in a cold bath. Other kids were made to make fun of me and made to ridicule me because of my disability. And this made things even harder for me. I still suffer from depression to this day. And several times I've tried to commit suicide.
I'm just emotional. I know how it feels. I was like that 38 years ago. This is your life. I know I was like that yesterday.
The sister in charge came over, had a look at the floor and told me it wasn't done right. So she gave me a cloth and told me to go on my knees and polish it further to get a shine up, which I did. And as I went down on my knees, she put a boot into my back a couple of times. My legs spread, my arms spread, and I just looked up to her and she told me to get it done properly.
I'm sure I did, I'm sure.
The doctor examined me and he said that I'd been kicked, and this was the toe of a boot or a shoe that had went into my skin, and in his opinion it was bad bruising.
For a second, this is Veronica. That's Veronica. Oh, you here?
I've watched other children getting abused. I've watched nuns hitting and slapping and punching and trailing arms near out their sockets. So, I mean, 200 or 300 kids can't all be wrong.
Children share dormitories depending on what age they were. The under-5s were in a separate nursery, but former residents say punishments meted out were the same everywhere. Everyone says bedwetting was seen as a cardinal sin by the nuns, who checked children's beds during the night. The guilty would be punished, sometimes beaten, forced to stand outside the nun's cell with a urine-soaked sheet over their heads, or thrown into a cold bath.
My younger sister, she'd waken me up and say, I've wet the bed, I've wet the bed, I've wet the bed. And I thought, oh no. So I either kind of just jump into her bed and put her pyjamas on and pretend it was me that had done it, or constantly swapping sheets or whatever she'd done, or if it was just on her pyjamas, or if it was on the sheet, and we would turn around. And then I would just take the cold bath that came with it. It was just, I was too scared to argue about, you know, a child, so you don't.
And this was sadistic treatment. This wasn't just a case of going to a home and the nuns were strict and you did as you're told. The cruelty that went on there, mentally and physically.
It's a big family, weren't they? You and Wiggins were always in it, weren't you? You were always genius.
It's all in trouble, wasn't it? The same nun every time. She'd be standing in the middle of the corridor, so you had to pass her. There was no thing. The nuns used to carry what's called drying sticks. Right. They were little sticks about that long, and they would actually wear drying sticks because we used to have their little cupboards, didn't we? And used to hang this racks. Used to have them in the pockets, normally the right pockets, or up the sleeves. She was like a gun, wasn't it? She used to stand there in the middle. Do you remember, Peter? She used to stand in the middle, and you'd be walking along the corridor. You were walking too fast, or you were walking too slow. There was something, and as you're walking past, you went, "Hurry up, boy!" Slap.
They came in to the dormitory and they smelt it, you know, pee, and I could hear them. I was only a wee girl, but I could hear them going out checking everybody's clothes and everything, and they found my pants under my clothes, and that nun dragged me out of that bed, and she made me kneel in front of her cell. It was just a wee room partitioned off, and she made me kneel in front of that cell, and then she would say to you, get up and wash those pants, get back to your bed. And of course, when you got up in the morning, the pants weren't dry, so you had to put them on. It was shocking.
There was one occasion where I got my hand stuck in the radiator. I was just sitting talking and playing about like kids do, and the next thing I knew my hand was stuck, and one of the children ran off to tell, I think it was Sister Mary, and she came back and she said, oh Riley, you mean messing about again? We were always called by our second names, never called by a Christian name. And she says, well, I'll teach you. And she turned the radiator on. And of course the radiator got hot and my hand started to swell, and I was screaming and trying to pull my hand out.
For Christine's sister Grace, life was so awful she tried to jump out of a first-floor window.
I remember one particular day trying to drag her in a bathroom window. She was trying to commit suicide. It was an upstairs window. She was about 8 or 9 years old. I'm 11 months older than her, and there was myself and 2 other girls trying to drag her back in. She'd had enough. I remember Grace wetting the bed once, and she sat about her with the dining room chair leg, and she was beating her with it, and I dived on her back, and she got all the other kids in the group to sit on me while she beat Grace, and then she beat me after.
All right.
Yeah. So that was just, there's no wonder she tried to jump out the window.
You never used to eat your dinner, you used to keep it in your mouth. We were just talking about that.
Mealtimes for some of the children held no joy either. People we've spoken to say a lot of the food was poor, but refusing to eat it was another transgression, which the nuns dealt with harshly.
You would sit at the dining room table and you knew what was coming. You knew you couldn't force yourself to eat this food. A carer would pin you down at the back with your 2 arms each side of you, and the sister would pinch your nose so she couldn't breathe. You'd open your mouth and the food would get shovelled in. You were gagging the whole time it was getting put in. You were trying to swallow. She was agitated and angry around you. You knew it was coming. You couldn't force yourself, and you would vomit up the food she had forced down. Of course that would set her off worse. She was still trying to shovel this food in. The end result would be total chaos. The plate, the spoon, everything would go flying, and she'd batter you.
But you see, when we used to tell our father what was happening, he wouldn't believe it. He would say, I didn't think they would do that.
I know, I'd go and tell my father.
So did it happen? The sisters deny the allegations, and the church is critical of the way the information for the civil case has been gathered. A Glasgow law firm sent out a questionnaire detailing acts of cruelty, asking clients to tick the relevant boxes. The church says many former residents have happy memories, which conflict with these allegations.
Yes, I do. Who's that like?
I believe, they believe it, if that sounds right. I mean, I think it's just discipline. Maybe they thought the discipline was turned into brutality, you know. I got worse than that at school with the belt. I remember the belt, and that was a lot worse than I'd ever get off any nun in my time there. If we were at the bed, we would just get up and put the sheets in the washing basket and got a new sheet. I mean, most of the time we'd done that ourselves. But if we hadn't, then the staff just changed it and nothing was said really.
Grampian police have conducted an investigation into the allegations made about the home in Aberdeen, and a report's been sent to the Crown Office. Lawyers acting for the victims say if the sisters don't settle out of court now, they'll put forward 6 test cases for compensation in the next few weeks. The courts will have to decide not just whether the allegations are true, but whether the punishments meted out were exceptionally harsh, even by the standards of institutional childcare at the time. Could the nuns have mistreated the children? Allegations of ill treatment are not only made against the nuns running the homes. Former residents say other staff did the same, and even worse. We're aware of cases where people claim they were sexually abused by 4 men working for the nuns in Aberdeen, and Lass Wade in the 60s.
It used to make me play about with him and interfere with him and do things to him what a man would want little girls to do to them without actual intercourse taking place. How can a kid stand up and say, look, this person's doing this to me, please help me? Because nobody's going to believe them.
I happened on him one day in the changing room. I don't know whether it was planned on his part or not. It was the children's changing room. You had to go through it to get outside to the yard. And as I went through, he was sitting there and he was exposed, and I could see him in the mirror. As I walked through, the mirror was on him, and he got the eye contact. So he says, oh, you're looking at me, aren't you? Come over here. And he demanded that I come over and touch him. And there was other occasions where he would get me on my own and he would make me touch him and he would touch me.
It was kind of known in the children's home that he was a bit of a dodgy bloke. He was, and whenever I saw him, he'd smelt of drink, and his nose was bright red, you know, and really heavy red face. I always remember that. But I remember hearing about girls and boys taken into a van, but not paying any attention to it. And he did that to me one day. He took me into the van and sexually interfered with me under my pants. But what can you do? You can't tell anybody.
So you didn't tell anybody?
Oh no, no. They wouldn't have believed you for a million years.
I was a target. I suppose Peter was a target because we never ever got pocket money. We always got stopped for some reason. And this guy used to, obviously knew.
And he was dead kind.
That's right. He was a kind old janitor, and he used to give you sweets, and he'd ask if you got pocket money that week. And you know, he'd say no.
He knew I didn't, because he was greeting and everything.
Yeah. And so what he used to do was he used to
talk you in,
get you into the boxing shed, and then when that, you know, after that he would. It was routine. He'd start off, you know, he'd spank your bum, didn't he?
Yeah. Penny a smack it.
Yeah, yeah. But then after a while, it would be something else. It would be like touching, and then that'd be another little.
So that's you've got another complex.
Yeah. I went to the nuns and told them that he slapped me. He played with me, made me play with him. I remember being told that I was telling wicked lies. After that, he got me on my own.
Well, there's none to take things to you, I know.
And you know, like, you know, you learn not to. You learn to deal with it. You learn to hold it and allow it to happen.
30 years on, Jimmy McGuigan and hundreds of others are fighting back. Successful claims could cost the sisters millions of pounds. According to their own financial accounts, the Poor Sisters themselves are worth £154 million. Lawyers for both sides are preparing their cases. Across the other side of the world in Australia, the Poor Sisters have also faced allegations of cruelty, but there the approach has been very different. Former residents of Nazareth Homes have been contacted to ask how they were treated, and a helpline's been set up. The church also runs a scheme to help victims of sexual abuse by members of religious orders. The Australian Church acknowledges that physical abuse is a major issue and that the church has to be more open than it was in the past.
It was some of the inappropriate ways that church authorities responded to the complaints that added to the scandal and to the lack of credibility that developed from then on.
This is the one that was in, it's a 1955 group. I'm in that one, and this is Sister.
Yeah, so she was there when we were there, but she was much older then.
Bad memories.
So she couldn't do much.
She was the one that bashed everybody.
Whatsoever. Who's this? Not Juliana?
No.
Here the nuns had the same obsession with bedwetters.
There was a little girl who was 5 who put her pants in class. And anyway, Sister Imelda went up to her, dragged her out and put her down on the floor and made her lick up her urine, and got one of the other girls, gave her the stick and said if she brings her head up once, hit her. If I wet the bed, it'd be either one of the nuns or one of the older girls. They'd come in, they used to pull the sheets back and then they'd rub our faces into it until our nose bled, or our whole face would be just red, you know, and stink of urine. And then we'd go and have breakfast, and we'd go to school, and then the nun would say, like, who wet the bed? Then you'd have to stand up on the desk, right, and then she'd call us all down to the front, and we'd have to stand in the hot water, and up to a lock probably about here, and we'd have to stand, it could be half an hour, 20 minutes to half an hour, till the water had cooled off a bit, you know, and like, it wasn't enough to make blisters. They were pretty clever, you know, but our legs used to burn, and we'd be dancing, you know, like this sort of thing. So, but the thing is, you couldn't get out of it. If you got out of it, you'd just go bang.
That's my school photo.
Mealtimes too were an ordeal.
I would have been about 12, 13.
Oh, yeah, because you were at St. Elise.
Yes. I remember having to eat meat that wasn't cooked properly. It was like a stew, and it had sort of hair on it. And the nun stood over me because I refused to eat it and made me eat it. Of course, then when I vomited it, I was forced to eat it. I can't even stand to look at meat even today. It has not changed.
Has not changed.
As long as that building's still there, those memories are still there.
The nun come through the door, and the girls, like an automatic reflex, their hands went up over their head in protection. Well, you know, I sort of glanced around wondering, you know, what is happening here, and so over the head went my hands. I was soon to learn that this particular nun would, you know, walk around, and a movement in the wrong direction, or a murmur here or a murmur there, bang, bang, and you soon learnt, you know, cover up.
In Australia, the Catholic bishops have appointed a priest who coordinates response to allegations of all kinds of abuse. It has a commission to investigate claims of sexual abuse and a fund to compensate victims. They offer counselling, but most importantly, they're prepared to hear the victims out.
What we've tried to do, particularly in the last few years, is listen more to the victims, and to do that in ways where we actually learn from them and learn what they've gone through, not only what they've gone through, but what the church has done to them in abuses of power, and to see that there are structures within the church that need to be confronted around the abuse of power.
Ray Wire is an internationally recognised expert on abuse. He was called in by the Catholic Church in Australia to assist in responding to allegations of abuse there. They took his advice.
There was an apology by the Bishop of Melbourne publicly. Another bishop went publicly in the television to apologise, to be open. There are still problems because technically the church is in lots of organisations, and they need to get all those organisations to subscribe to the procedures that are being laid down. But they're moving forward.
We've learnt very clearly that at the end of the day, that adopting a purely legal framework is not only damaging to victims, but also damaging to the church, because the general community and the church community is expecting us here in Australia to be authentic to the gospel of Jesus Christ that we preach, and the gospel of love and compassion to people, and to show that in this very important area of dealing with victims of abuse.
The most important thing the church needs to do is to be open, to recognise that abuse did go on, that we don't have to get into cover-up, that we don't have to run away from it, that we can listen and hear, and if I was going to use a biblical phrase, the truth can be used to set people free, and that includes the church.
In Scotland, after a sex scandal involving a trainee priest, the Catholic Church appointed 10 child protection advisors last year to talk to people who say they've been abused.
If anybody that was in either our direct care or the care of people who are church personnel are feeling that they weren't given the best kind of treatment, we must listen to them, and where it's appropriate, apologise that that's how they experience what happened to them.
Unlike the church in Australia, her child protection advisors have no power to investigate or compensate, but can only refer people onto other bodies.
The big move in Scotland nowadays is to allow authorities to do that it's much more independent. And so with many of the allegations that have been made against any kind of church personnel, whatever the church happens to be, the big thing now is to say you can't really investigate this easily from within. And you also have to be very trained, and you've not to muck up legal process in doing it. So there are two agencies that do that kind of investigation, and that's the police and social work departments. And they should be the ones that are investigating any form of abuse.
All of which takes time, and so far time hasn't healed the bitterness of the children of Nazareth.
They've stolen our childhood. We're never going to get that back.
I just want justice at the end of the day for all my family, what they've gone through, and an apology is not good enough.
If they are quite religious and God-loving people, then to me their own guilt is the punishment that's actually out in the open. To me, that is punishment enough.
Their duty of taking us in there was to look after us and care for us until we were reasonably able to do that for ourselves. But they didn't do it.
Que ya el cristianismo para mucha gente es la religión y la religión el cristianismo. Aún más, Satanás ha hecho creer esa mentira por 1600 años, especialmente desde que el Vaticano fuera establecido en la muerte del emperador Constantino en el año 337. Déjeme darle nota histórica y profética de ello. A la muerte de un emperador que nació pagano, vivió pagano y murió pagano, a pesar de lo que la historia le haya dicho a usted, a pesar de lo que los historiadores hayan declarado de su conversión a Cristo, a pesar de las fantasías y encantaciones por encantadores, agoreros, adivinos, que en el nombre de Cristo, como falsos profetas, no solamente distorsionaron la historia, no solo de Israel, no solo de la Iglesia, pero aún la historia de esta nación mexicana. Déjeme decirle que en este atentado contra la historia del Evangelio, contra la historia de la Iglesia, contra la historia de Cristo, también Satanás ha ido lejos para distorsionar la historia de los pueblos, la historia de las naciones, incluyendo la patria mexicana. Todavía en las escuelas de México se estudia, se lee, llegando hasta las universidades mexicanas, que los monjes católicos romanos, las monjas, los sacerdotes y los obispos llegaron hace 500 años a los aborígenes de esta tierra para predicarles el Evangelio. Mentira de Satanás, mentira de Satanás, mentira del anticristo. Si hace 500 años los monjes que vinieron protegidos por el ejército español, por el ejército francés, por el ejército portugués, si esos monjes, ese clero, hubieran creído al Evangelio de Cristo, no hubiera, como hizo Hidalgo, traído la falsa revelación de la guadalupana. Hubieran creído a Jesucristo, a Jesucristo, a Jesucristo y al Evangelio de Jesucristo. La historia ha sido distorsionada porque el Evangelio ha sido pervertido. ¿Para qué hablar más de lo que ya esta tierra ha padecido, está padeciendo, no como consecuencia política solamente, no como consecuencia económica, no como consecuencia cultural, no como consecuencia moral, no como consecuencia ajena a lo que la religión ha hecho en 500 años de perversión del Evangelio de Jesucristo? No hubiera habido guerra. Aún más, si hace 500 años este mensaje de Cristo, dado en el Sermón del Monte, allá en Israel, hubiera sido creído por ese clero, en el día de hoy no habrían ni mormones en México. En el día de hoy no habrían espiritistas. En el día de hoy no habrían santeros. En el día de hoy no habrían encantadores, adivinos, agoreros. Lo que es más grande en el día de hoy, ni siquiera el gobierno hubiera tenido que gastar dinero en rehabilitar drogadictos o en combatirlos en las montañas de México, porque todo eso ha sido producto no de la política, no de la sociedad, pero de la religión que pervirtió el Evangelio de Jesucristo. Alabe a Jesucristo. Si usted ya ha creído el Evangelio, usted sabe lo que se está diciendo. Usted ha sido testigo. Usted ha sido testigo de lo que aquí se declara por el Espíritu de Dios. México ya no necesita de programas de rehabilitación. Tiene demasiados, si usted no lo sabía. Hasta el diablo tiene sus programas de rehabilitación. Los endroga por un lado y después los rehabilita por otro. El mismo demonio. Ríase del diablo en el nombre de Jesús. Es una mofa diabólica. Es una payasada satánica. El Vaticano tiene sus mejores adictos en los dirigentes y negociantes de la droga internacional. Escuche bien esto. Segundo, son los fabricantes de licores más fuertes económicamente y tecnológicamente. Las destilerías más avanzadas las tiene el Vaticano. Y después tiene centros de rehabilitación para alcohólicos, incluyendo Alcohólicos Anónimos, que fue fundado por los jesuitas a escondidas. Ahora oigan los Alcohólicos Anónimos. Esto se revela por primera vez en Tijuana. Óigalo los Alcohólicos Anónimos. Óigalo el obispo de Tijuana. Óigalo el pueblo católico romano. La insidia, la conspiración, la perversión, la distorsión, la falsedad, la hipocresía, ya no solo hasta los sentidos y la conciencia humana, pero ahora hasta el alma del ser humano, hasta el alma del ser humano. Escúcheme bien. Jesús dice, por sus frutos los conoceréis. estoy dando a conocer algunos frutos. Entre los más grandes destiladores de brandy, de coñac, de ron, de cerveza, escúcheme, de vino, de whisky, escúcheme bien, están, le voy a dar solo dos nombres de los más grandes, dos de los muchos. Entre los monjes católicos están los monjes benedictinos, la orden de los monjes benedictinos, que destila más licor que todas las destilerías juntas en México. Los monjes no solo rezan el rosario, están destilando lo que ha hecho su familia miserable y ha hecho a este país quedar en ruina. Escuche bien. Entre las otras órdenes religiosas están los hermanos de la doctrina cristiana. Y se llaman hasta hermanos de la doctrina cristiana, escúchelo. Que como La Salle se dedican a educar, mientras educan los niños, emborrachan a los padres con el licor que destilan y después siguen sacando dinero de los centros de rehabilitación. Porque usted mismo va a dar dinero a los centros de rehabilitación. Su piedad y su fe católica lo hace así posible. Mientras que la explotación, ya no solo del cuerpo, ya no solo de la conciencia, pero como dice la palabra de Dios, del alma, llega hasta el punto de pedírsele dinero también para misas de sufragio, cuando perdieron el cuerpo y el alma de ese infeliz padre, de esa infeliz madre y de esos infelices hijos que murieron sin dársele el Evangelio de Jesucristo. Escúcheme bien. Se quiere hacer una sola iglesia, una sola religión oficial, como Constantino la hizo desde el principio, adoptando al catolicismo romano como su hija. No fue al cristianismo. Constantino no se convirtió. No hubo frutos de acuerdo a la doctrina de Cristo de que se hubiera convertido Constantino al cristianismo. No hubo frutos. En otras palabras, amados, no habiendo frutos de su conversión al Evangelio, los historiadores encontraron en él que había frutos conforme la perversión del Evangelio. Vamos a dar dos aclaraciones. Primero, dice que Constantino en su visión, este fue el primer papa del catolicismo romano, no fue Pedro. Pedro nunca estuvo en Roma, Pablo fue el que estuvo en Roma, escribió antes de llegar a Roma hasta una carta que está en el Nuevo Testamento, está en la Biblia católica, la epístola a los romanos, y cuando él escribió esa carta, señala a muchos de sus compatriotas, a muchos de sus condiscípulos, pero nunca mencionó ni siquiera a Pedro, mucho menos le mandó saludos y mucho menos se dirigió a Pedro como papa, ni lo mencionó en toda su carta. Vamos a dar dos aclaraciones. Primero, dice que Constantino en su visión, este fue el primer papa del catolicismo romano, no fue Pedro. Pedro nunca estuvo en Roma, Pablo fue el que estuvo en Roma, escribió antes de llegar a Roma hasta una carta que está en el Nuevo Testamento, está en la Biblia católica, la epístola a los romanos, y cuando él escribió esa carta, señala a muchos de sus compatriotas, a muchos de sus condiscípulos, pero nunca mencionó ni siquiera a Pedro, mucho menos le mandó saludos y mucho menos se dirigió a Pedro como papa, ni lo mencionó en toda su carta. Alabe a Jesús por la verdad del Evangelio, alabe a Jesús que desenmascara no solo las perversiones revelaciones de su palabra, pero las distorsiones de la historia. Las distorsiones de la historia. Hasta muchos historiadores protestantes, claro está, protestantes de nombre, hay bautistas de nombre, hay metodistas de nombre, hay nazarenos de nombre, hay evangélicos de nombre y hay muchos pentecostales de nombre.